I think we might get started. We have three wonderful guests in our panel, which is all about the globalization. I paused to make sure I got it right, and it's been a long 22 hours. I slowed down to get it right, and I still got it wrong. But we have the wonderful David Bose, Veronique de Rugy, and I don't have my information in front of me, Stephanie Slade. There we are. And David, let's go to you first. What are your thoughts on globalization? Is it a good thing? And should people be worried about it? Because some people are.
Right. Well, thank you. It's a delight to be here. I have been watching since 6 p.m. last night, Washington time, although with breaks in between. So I do want to start with what is globalization? Globalization is the free movement, or let's say free-ish movement of goods, capital, people, and ideas around the world and across borders. It's not world government, and I think that's something that troubles some libertarians. Sometimes there are organizations that might be considered part of globalization that are sort of world government. We can talk about that later if you want to. But what I mean is the freer movement of goods, capital, people, and ideas. And that globalization is a great boon to the world. It means more specialization and division of labor, which are vital components of economic progress. It makes rich countries richer and brings poor countries out of crushing poverty. Market reforms within countries are important, but becoming part of the global division of labor has been crucial to the rise of middle classes in China, India, Mexico, Chile, and Eastern Europe. Not everybody has risen into the middle class, but the proportion of the world population in extreme poverty declined from 36% in 1990 to 10% in 2015. That's the biggest story of the epoch, maybe the greatest achievement in human history. Steven Pinker spoke at the Cato Institute about his book, Enlightenment Now, a couple of years ago, and he said, every newspaper ought to be headlining every day, 130,000 people around the world moved out of extreme poverty yesterday. But people don't know that because it's never a newspaper headline. People don't know this. You poll Americans, you find that 66% of Americans think world poverty has doubled in the past 20 years, when in fact it's been slashed by more than half, more than 2/3 if you go back 25 years. Trade and specialization are win-win, and that's what a lot of people don't get about trade generally. They think there's winners and losers. Trade and specialization are win-win. They're about a growing pie. And really, when you talk about trade and specialization, what's the alternative? Self-sufficiency? I should make my own clothes, make my own furniture? A few years ago, a YouTube host has a show called How to Make Everything. His name is Andy George, and he came up with the idea, I'm going to make a chicken sandwich from scratch. Instead of just going to the restaurant or to the grocery, I'm going to make a chicken sandwich from scratch. What happened? Well, he found out it took 6 months and $1,500 to grow a garden, turn ocean water into salt, make cheese, kill a chicken, all so he could make a sandwich from scratch. That is sort of the alternative. And of course, that required him to be able to travel from his home to where the ocean was, among other things. Now, nobody really means that, of course, when they criticize trade and globalization. But do they mean close off our country and only buy American? If that's good for Americans, then why not only buy California or only buy Los Angeles? Or how about your neighborhood? Buy West Side Los Angeles instead of the whole city. And when you put it that way, it seems obviously crazy. But economically, there's no reason that I, living here in Virginia in the United States of America, should be any more concerned about buying a product made in Australia than buying one in Maryland or Colorado. I buy what's best for me. People sell where they can get the best price. And what that creates is economic growth. That's like the definition of economic growth, that we get more output, more consumer satisfaction for the amount of input. And that really is what globalization is. It's saying, hey, why don't we make the whole world like the United States? I can buy from any state in the country. Why can't I buy from any country in the world? A lot of libertarians know the old article by Leonard Read, I Pencil, in which he said, no one knows how to make a pencil. And he talked about the economic complexity involved in making something as simple as a pencil. And he wasn't writing about international trade or globalization. He didn't really talk about that. But if you go through his article, he mentions you get the wood for the pencil from Oregon, you get the graphite from Sri Lanka, you get the wax from Mexico, you get castor oil from the tropics, you get rubber from Indonesia. All of those things are part of having a globalized economy. My colleague Dan Ikinson wrote a paper a while ago called Made on Earth. You know, we're always looking at the back of things and, oh, this was made in the USA. Oh, good. Oh, this was made in China. This was, when I was a kid, it was made in Japan. People thought made in Japan meant cheap stuff. Turned out in a few years, made in Japan meant the best cars in the world by some standards. Recently, the supply chain director at General Motors, talking about NAFTA, said, we have car parts and components coming back and forth across the border all the time. That's what the North American Free Trade Agreement did. It meant you didn't even have to worry that you were going to import or export. You just had the part worked on here and then sent over here. And sometimes it goes to Canada and sometimes it goes to Mexico. And you didn't have to worry about it. If you look at the back of your iPhone now, instead of just made in China, you'll see something more interesting. It says designed by Apple in California, assembled in China. Well, that's because we're able to have a world market where everything can be done where it's most efficient or cheapest. Globalization is bringing more people into the world economy, and it's bringing billions of people out of poverty. And going along with that process, I think both helping to create and reflecting that process is that Enlightenment values of tolerance and human rights are spreading to more parts of the world, and with particular emphasis on the rights of women, racial and religious minorities, and gay and lesbian and transgender people. If you look at the world, the parts that are the most globalized are generally becoming the most liberal in terms of all these extensions of dignity and humanity and respect to people who didn't get those before. The internet is giving people more information, more ways to connect, more commercial opportunities, and more choice. And despite what we may be led to think from the flood of information about the world, from our CNN screens, we are probably living in the most peaceful era in human history. But economic progress inevitably means change, and change can be painful. Think of the transition from 90% of American workers working on farms to about 2% today. And now we're in similar transitions from manufacturing to services and robots. And some people do get hurt in such transitions. They may lose their jobs or their businesses, or see their own wages not increasing as fast as other people's, or simply fear that such consequences may happen. And when people perceive a decline in their income or their relative social status, they often want help and they want to blame someone. And that can mean both a demand for government programs and the scapegoating of villains, whether it's the bankers, the 1%, the Jews, the immigrants, the Mexicans, or whoever, which is just the opposite of the individualist liberalism that we should be defending and advancing. And we've seen that process in the past century in various European countries, not to mention Venezuela recently, and to a lesser extent, even in the United States. These instincts can result in bad policy and sometimes worse outcomes: closed borders, pogroms, authoritarianism, even war. When goods cannot cross borders, armies will. It's been said for a long time. And today, we're seeing the rise of populist and illiberal forces, often organized against anything international like global trade. The Economic Freedom of the World report from the Fraser Institute reported last year, I think, parties that were once called right-wing populist parties that wanted to end social welfare now advocate anti-globalization, anti-free trade policies, restrictions on immigration, and increased social welfare for natives, but not for immigrants. As some suggest, anti-cosmopolitan cultural factors seem more important than purely economic insecurities for explaining support for populist parties. And the distinction between left and right populism is highly blurred. That's the end of the quote from Economic Freedom of the World. Here in the United States, you know, we're not Hungary, we're not Russia and China or Venezuela, but we have had 3 years of a president bent on cutting the United States off from the world, practically eliminating immigration, including legal immigration, and imposing all sorts of protectionist measures, which unfortunately Congress authorized our president to do, thinking that the president would act in the interest of the whole country, not anticipating a president who was determined to cut off trade. Meanwhile, his opponent just came out this week with his Buy American plan, like he's competing for ignorant populism with Trump. But in the past, he supported NAFTA and the TPP. So Trump has a 30-year record of opposing free trade. Biden has like a 2-year record of opposing free trade, but his longer record is somewhat more encouraging. In both cases, of course, what we're seeing is the problem of concentrated benefits and diffuse costs. I mean, we're seeing a big ideological problem and economic ignorance, but we're also seeing concentrated benefits and diffuse costs. Some people hope to benefit from tariffs that will hurt everybody else. You put a tariff on imported automobiles, for instance, the people who are making American automobiles may feel that they benefit, at least in the short run. But everybody in America who wants to buy a car is going to see the cost go up for a car, even an American car, because now they can raise price because the Japanese, German, Korean cars are more expensive. What I'm concerned about, and really the point I made earlier, huge decreases in the number of people in extreme poverty and simultaneous increases in human rights for marginalized groups. This is great. This is the greatest story in the world. And the world is getting better off. It's getting more economically free. It's getting more tolerant of formerly marginalized and sometimes still marginalized groups. But there is a reaction to that, a backlash. Ideas we thought were dead are back. Socialism, protectionism, ethnic nationalism, anti-Semitism, which, by the way, has always been entangled with anti-capitalism, and even, for God's sake, industrial policy, which we pushed back in the 1980s, and now here it is back again. And that's why our job as classical liberals and libertarians is not done, is probably never done. We need to respond to the rise of illiberalism on both left and right in different fashions in different parts of the world, but in the developed countries as well as the less developed countries, which is bringing with it threats to liberty, democracy, trade, growth, and even peace. But here we are. All the bad new ideas are really bad old ideas. Libertarians and classical liberals have been fighting them off for more than 200 years, and we're going to have to keep doing it. We have a White House strategist, a chief advisor to President Trump in his first year in office, who said it will be as exciting as the 1930s. Well, if you've read about the 1930s, all those ideas came together all over Europe and created catastrophe. So that's the kind of excitement I don't want to see. I want the excitement of new ideas, new technologies, new literature, new cuisines, new technology, being able to, someday we're going to go to Mars. I hope we don't have to go to Mars in order to escape the excitement that Steve Bannon and his crowd have created here on Earth. So it's time to rally around liberal values, defending globalization, defending human rights, defending liberalism generally. And as Tom Palmer said in the opening talk of this marathon, don't let us be the generation that lets liberalism go. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, David. That was a rich body of work. I just want to pick out one thing very quickly. You mentioned the incredible impact that the internet is having for the economic rights, as it were, of minorities that historically have been marginalized in a range of ways, sometimes very violently and sometimes more subtly. And I think it's a modern parallel, and others have said this as well, of what happened when the Sears catalog was invented in the US, and all of a sudden, black people, African Americans that had been marginalized, had been kept out of stores, weren't able to buy guns to protect themselves from the various people that were trying to do them harm. All of a sudden, they had the same economic rights, at least in terms of what they could purchase, as anybody else. But we're seeing that now on both the economic power to buy, but also the economic power to sell on the internet anonymously, when no one knows or cares what your identity necessarily is. I think it's a wonderful thing to see, and I'm sure there'll be some questions on that topic for you towards the end of this session, David. So thank you so much for that. Now, Veronique de Rougier, I believe you've got a few prepared remarks for us as well.
Yes, I'm glad to be right after David, because he perfectly set the stage for what I wanted to say, which is basically that bad theories are just like zombies. They never completely die, and on emergencies and crisis, like the zombie feed on brains. You would think I'm a zombie expert, I'm not. But
so what you're saying is that all of our lives are actually just a B-grade horror film? Is that what's happening here?
Exactly. And so just like zombies, so is this idea that protectionism is and should be revived. And for weeks now, this bad idea has been feeding on the argument that this pandemic that we're all going through was caused and aggravated by globalization and its close friends, free market, which is kind of funny when you think about it. I mean, and I think the listener here won't be surprised. I mean, it's fascinating in its own perverse way, because so I'm going to talk about the U.S., but I think this is a fact that is actually kind of recurring in most nations. The U.S. government has consistently run budget deficits. It's constantly issuing regulations that tells us what we can do, what we can't do, how we can do it or not do it. And specifically for the purpose of today, I mean, our government imposes way north of 10,000 lines of tariffs on all sorts of goods to restrict our ability to trade with our friends around the world. Yet, amazingly, many people persist in claiming that we live in a world where market fundamentalism runs rampant. It's kind of a laissez-faire hell with no government anywhere to be found. And globalization right now is really used and accused of being at the heart of this pandemic, because as David talked about, we ship goods across borders, supply chains are all over the globe, people go back and forth more than ever in planes, and immigrants are crossing borders, and our economy are really super interconnected. And it's as if never before in the industrial age have pandemic killed millions of people. I guess those who blame globalization for this pandemic have forgotten that there were pandemics in the past and that they killed millions, but also more importantly, that it took centuries before Louis Pasteur in 1885, building on the knowledge accumulated over centuries, created the first vaccine for rabies and other lethal disease. I also guess that those who blame globalization forgot the role played by the Trump tariffs on medical equipment imposed from China and the rest of the world, which seriously restricted our ability here in the US to get essential equipment such as thermometer and patient monitors and other items. And it is true, I'll say this, that this extreme connection between all of us, it does play a role in spreading this virus. But COVID-19 is not a disease of globalization or a monster unleashed by market fundamentalism. And this is really, I want to kind of give you some arguments to respond to this. The first thing is globalization and free markets will rescue us more quickly than otherwise from this nightmare. Think about it this way. Decades since the end of World War II, the 50, 60 years we've had, it's been a period of enormous advances in medicine and pharmacology. This period, until the past couple of years, has been one of falling trade barriers and increasing globalization and economic integration. And I will echo what David said. I mean, who can doubt that the increasing wealth that resulted from this trade contributed to humanity's ability to solve medical problems? Well, we shouldn't. We have tons of data for this. And who can doubt that the sharing of ideas and of skills that globalization makes possible does not give birth to new ideas, many of them essential to the marvel of modern medicine. Again, I mean, we have a lot of evidence of this. Without globalization of science, knowledge, and innovation, our ability to fight against COVID-19 would be much weaker. In fact, a few weeks ago, I saw a video by Johan Norberg of Cato, and I think it was building on some work by Ron Bailey at Reason. And it was a short video that explained that globalization, far from being responsible for this pandemic, is actually a great tool to combat it. And he gave this example, which I thought was really incredible, that it took merely 1 week for Chinese scientists to figure out the virus's DNA sequence using technology from the other side of the globe. And that thanks to this global cooperation, German scientists produced the first test within a few weeks, soon followed by many other tests. And as of today, there are like hundreds of scientists and companies all around the world searching for cures and vaccines. I mean, there's an intense competition between companies to be the first to find a solution to our global problem, because free market system promises a reward for those who succeed. But there is also intense collaboration between scientists that is enabled by globalization. And they are trying to understand the facts about this virus and sharing these discoveries with one another. Now, what about the idea? And that's actually something that we hear all the time. And this is something that all of us, I believe, are going to be fighting in our own country. This idea that if we produced more drugs and medical gear in our own countries, we would be better off the next time around. Well, there are several problems. And I actually hope if you learned something, anything from today, from my talk, these arguments and how to respond to those who make that claim. First, I mean, we need to get our facts straight. I mean, there's so many people from all around the world who are watching that I'm sorry, I'm going to be giving a purely American number here. But it is not the case that we in America are at the mercy of other countries for our medical supplies. So according to a recent study by the St. Louis Fed, 70%, 70%, of all medical goods consumed here last year were made in America. Second, global supply chains, right, that Trump wants to bring back, and I bet you your governments are going to want to bring back, are the way they are for a good economic reason. That's comparative advantage. Each link in every supply chain is performed by those producers in those countries that do that link best. Now, it is true that if the US or the world dropped all tariffs or reduced regulation significantly, we would see a change in supply chains based on the new set of comparative advantages that emerge. So it doesn't mean that I'm not saying that that supply chain is set in stone. In the same way, it is true that if the US became massively protectionist, like President Trump would like, and some of his advisors would like to see it become, supply chains would change to meet the new regulatory environment. And it may be the case that more medical supply would be produced here. However, and that's the important part, it would be done at tremendous cost. Yes, tariff and subsidy could bring more supply chains here, but in doing so, they make each link of the supply chain perform less efficiently and at a higher cost. And the implication is really important because it means that while we would produce a greater share of what we consume, it doesn't mean that we would actually produce more total output. In fact, empirical evidence suggests that it would reduce the investment in medical products and equipment, and eventually it would reduce overall supply. So we would be worse off. Tariffs and subsidies that are meant to bring the supply chain back into our own countries, they also create a second layer of distortion. They reduce competition, and they reduce the incentives of domestic producers to innovate and to operate as efficiently as possible. And the longer they're in place, the worse and more costly our homegrown, secure medical supplies become relative to what they would have been without these tariffs and subsidies. So the bottom line is that if we end up living in a world that President Trump and I bet you a lot of other of your government officials will want to see, we have less globalization, it is likely that we get less supply of medical equipment over time and crappy quality products. That's the technical term. Finally, I actually want to say another thing is like this notion that we should prepare for the next pandemic by bringing back the home country production of our medical supply is typical backward government looking. It's like driving forward while looking in the rear view mirror. It's very unlikely, however, that the next medical emergency will be a viral pandemic. And even if it is, we are not guaranteed that it will be one that requires the same supply that are useful to fight this fight. So in other words, we're like changing everything for no good reason. And that's why we should aim for is to have a system that maximizes supply, the supply of medical product, no matter what they are, not just to fight COVID-19. And this result is possible only in a world where producers source the input in a way that makes sense, the most sense to them based on market signals, that's prices, basically. In that world, input suppliers from around the world have strong incentives to improve the quality of their offerings and to sell these to the lowest possible price. The other thing that's important to understand, and I think Stephanie is going to actually talk about this, is like those on the right and on the left who are eager to blame globalization for this pandemic are now just economically illiterate, but they are just using this crisis, like zombies do with brain, as an excuse to remake the world into the image that they were advocating before this crisis began. They were against trade, against immigration, against technology, and against market before, and they are now seizing this opportunity to basically just call for those same old, not dead enough ideas of the past. And it is really important because, as David said, it's hard to overstate really actually the impact and the benefit that globalization has had on all of us, but especially on the poorest people in the globe. And we need to fight as hard as we can. Libertarians and free market people who've done it in the past, and we can do it again.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the greatest illustration of just the importance of globalization and how it has helped the poor is the warning that we're getting from the UN right now that the breakdown in market function and transport of food around the world is going to push an extra 130 million people onto the brink of starvation before the end of this year. We're talking 5 months away, 130 million people, because of the breakdown in exactly what you're talking about, that global cooperation, getting our food from the place that has the greatest comparative advantage and selling it to the place where they can get the highest price for it. So thank you. And also 10,000 lines of regulation. Was that just in the US?
It's actually much more. I just went for the bulk of it, but it's many more. But they're also, it's worth saying that there are tariffs and then there are regulatory barriers too. Yes. In addition to actually pure tariff, there's just it's just like, so anyone who actually thinks that, we're like it's free trade, like gone wild.
Completely not. Look, we've got a lot of questions coming in, but first we're gonna poke the brains of our listeners and our viewers even more before we get to their questions with some thoughts from Stephanie.
Thank you so much. It's just such an honor to be here. I want to take everybody back to the year 1980. I want to take you to a black tie gala that was being hosted that year to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the founding of the magazine National Review. And at that event, George Will was the keynote speaker. And one of the things that he said was that William F. Buckley, the founder of National Review, had seen for many years the Republican Party as a vessel, and he had worked to fill that vessel with a, quote, intellectually defensible modern conservatism. Now, today, National Review has a different editor. His name is Rich Lowry, and he has sort of taken it upon himself to make the case for something called nationalism. He has a book, The Case for Nationalism, that was out last year. What he argues is that nationalism is merely love of country, to love your country, to feel proud of your country, to want to defend it against outside threats. He says it's about breaking down tribal group loyalties and building up a sort of national cohesiveness. And importantly, he insists that to be a nationalist doesn't require you to adopt any particular policy agenda. In essence, he's saying it's substantively empty. And I'm going to make the argument that he's arguing that it's a sort of empty vessel. He certainly would say that it certainly doesn't have to involve, nationalism doesn't have to involve a rejection of classical liberalism. That's his position. I think that position is willfully ignorant. And I'm going to give you two reasons for why that is. The first one is that we already have a word for love of country and a desire to see your country endure. And that word is patriotism. The good thing about the word patriotism is that it is sort of universally understood. It's not confusing to anybody. We basically all hear that word and we more or less know what it means. It also has an overwhelmingly positive connotation. People don't think that being a patriot makes you scary. Not so with nationalism. And so the fact that he, sort of wants to use the word nationalism, he has made a point of making the case not for patriotism, but for nationalism. It raises the question, it should raise the question for all of us, of what else might be being smuggled in there under this pretty vessel. The second reason I think that his position fails is that whether Rich Lowry likes it or not, nationalism is a vessel. And while he is busy burnishing the outside of the vessel, a lot of other people are also busy filling it with their own substantive policy agenda and their goals. And those are people like Tucker Carlson and Steve Bannon and Viktor Orban. And they have things that they're trying to accomplish, and they are also using the vessel of nationalism to try to get where they want to go. There was a big conference here in DC last summer, the National Conservatism Conference. I attended it. I wanted to hear, straight from their mouths, what did the new nationalists want? What are they all about? What I saw was a group of people who were obsessed with dominance on the global stage and purity at home. Okay, concretely speaking, they have an agenda that they're pushing. And although not everybody necessarily agrees on all the specifics all the time, I think it boils down to four main things. One is aggressive immigration restrictions. The second is high tariffs on imports. The third is industrial policy, that is sort of top-down national government subsidies and other efforts to prop up the domestic manufacturing sector and make sure that foreign manufacturers can never outcompete us. And then the fourth thing, this is maybe a little surprising, it's the one thing that's not like the others, is they want, almost all of them, want stricter laws to enforce a sort of traditionalist conservative morality. And so the emblematic policy example of this would be, they talk a lot about how we need to do a better job of censoring pornography and keeping it out of the hands of kids. Now, setting aside that fourth one, which is a little bit different, go back to what David described earlier is what globalization is all about. It's the free movement of goods and people and ideas across borders. Immigration restrictions, tariffs, industrial policy, these are all things that are attacking globalization at their core. And very importantly, the policies that they're pushing and the agenda that they're pushing involves doing all these things coercively through the strong arm of the state. So what they're not just doing is saying, hey, Americans, or hey, Australians, or whoever, you have a moral obligation to your fellow citizens, and therefore we encourage you to choose to buy a domestically produced item instead of a foreign item. They could do that, and then they could make that argument. That would be fine with me. They can make their argument because it would respect my right to then make a different choice. And if I want to buy a Toyota instead of a Ford, I could do that. But that's not what they're doing. What they're saying is we want protectionist policy, again, especially at the national level, that raises prices for everyone and that punishes those who might make a different choice. And so it's not about persuasion, it's about coercion. I think that's very important. This session is about globalization, of course. I hope it's pretty clear that what I'm describing is an agenda that stands against globalization, and they're pretty explicit about it themselves. But what I want to say is that nationalism isn't just opposed to globalization. That is to say, it isn't just concerned with global markets and also global governance. It also stands opposed to individualism because it is coercive, because it believes that the state should have the right to override your choice if it doesn't like the choice that you want to make, because it has such a great affection for government power, because it demands that individual autonomy be subordinated to the collective good. They would call it the national interest, and they would say that the national interest is the most important thing that policy ought to reflect, which by definition, I mean, they don't say this, but by definition, what that means is that individual choices are subordinated. And in some cases, they come right out with it, and they'll say, we have been worshiping at the altar of individual autonomy, and no more. It's time for a different outlook. This is a collectivistic and an anti-individualistic way of looking at the world. Now, a couple of hours ago, right here on this stage, my friend Dan McCarthy gave a talk about conservative nationalism, and he said that libertarians ought to view the rise of this sort of national conservative moment as essentially a wake-up call for us, because it points to the fact that there are a lot of people out there in our countries, sort of in middle America or your average citizen in whatever country you're in, who are dissatisfied with the liberal status quo. Now that, I think, is a really important point, actually, and we ought not dismiss it. There is clearly a lot of dissatisfaction among voters and among regular people with the status quo as they're experiencing it. And if we pretend that everything is great and we only ever talk about the incredible miracles that David began this talk by describing, then we're not talking to them, to these people who are feeling this frustration, and they're feeling like they've been left behind in some way. But to acknowledge that there maybe is a problem is not to say that the nationalists have the right solution. And because the agenda that they are sort of laying out is, I think, precisely the opposite of everything we stand for as libertarians and as classical liberals, I reject that is the answer. I categorically reject it. It doesn't matter how beautiful the vessel is. What matters is what is in that vessel. And I'm not happy. I'm afraid by what I see in the vessel of nationalism. So I'll end there.
Thank you so much. And three very different perspectives from each other, not disagreeing with each other, but each coming from very different angles
different points of view
on the issue. I know you've got some great questions there, but I'd actually like to lead with one from myself, because this is an issue that I do discuss with people on my Facebook page, as well as just in my personal life. Talking about this, I'm a huge advocate, obviously, for open borders, for open movement of goods and people, etc. And almost invariably, especially for people that have never thought this through before, the reflexive response is, we can't run trade deficits forever. And that often comes actually from more the conservative end of the political spectrum, where they are a bit more concerned about the financial side of things and national debt. And somehow this trade deficit is this spectre that in their mind immediately makes the idea of free trade just not tenable, it's not sustainable. And David, maybe if we could start with you, can I get a response to that? How do you deal with that objection?
Well, you might want to ask an economist, but the way I would say it would be, one of the things I said early on was there's really no difference in economic terms between my trading with an Australian or a Canadian and my trading with a Kentuckian. And nobody ever worries about the trade deficit between Virginia and Kentucky. But I guarantee you there is one. If you add up the numbers, there's going to be a trade deficit between each combination of states in the United States. we don't care, because we know that as long as each exchange is perceived to be to the benefit of both parties, then both parties are improving their situation, and adding it up doesn't change that. There are some technical issues here, I think. A lot of times people talk about the manufacturing trade deficit, which makes the United States look worse, but that's because we sell a whole lot of services, financial services, movies, software, things like that to the rest of the world. You add that in, then the trade deficit is less. The trade deficit can also reflect bad policies at home that may be affecting the value of the dollar versus the value of the euro and so on. But the main point to me is just stop thinking it matters that Australia is a different country. Australia is a bunch of people each trying to improve his own life. America's also a bunch of people each trying to improve his own life. And when we trade, we both win.
If I can add something.
Yes, please do.
Can I add something? I mean, David is entirely right. The example I often use is actually that I don't even compare people trading, states trading with one another. I always bring it back to the individual and say, you always have a trade deficit with your grocery store. Is that a problem? And it's not, because people understand, right, that you give them money, but in exchange, you get the stuff really you want, and you get to actually shop around between the different grocery stores and even between the branches within a given country. So that's one point. But there's a more technical point, and I'm going to try to actually make it in a way that's simple, which is the thing that people don't understand about the trade deficit is that while it is true we get goods from people and we send them dollars, let's say this. I mean, one of the reasons why foreigners are so interested in actually selling us stuff is because they want our dollars, right? That's what they want. This is why the grocery store is interested in trading with me. What do these dollars do? When these dollars are used, they're really valuable in the global economy, and they are used to actually trade between different countries. But they also, when you actually look, every single dollar we send abroad, and this is important, and people need to remember this because it's so important, they always come back to us. Every single one. There is an equivalence between the goods we buy and the capital we send abroad. It always comes back, and it comes back in the form, that's the dollars that foreigners use to actually buy our exports. So there's a relationship with how much we buy from others and how much they buy from us. And the surest way to reduce our exports is to slash our imports. The other thing is they come back in the form of investment to us. And they come back and they are invested, not in just buying all our factories and turning them all in. The big fear, as David said, in the 80s, Japan, and now it's like China. And then it can guarantee you in the future it will be something else, probably India or something else. But also they buy our debt. And the truth of the matter is, like, until this government decides to spend like a drunken sailor, we should be actually quite grateful that that these guys are buying our debt because interest rates remain low. So I think that's the technical point that people fail to understand all the time.
As I like to put it, I have a terrible trade deficit with my local wine merchant.
Yeah.
And obviously the solution is that I need to apply a tariff to myself to encourage me to buy from a different wine merchant. Obviously that's the solution. I mean, that's what tariffs do, isn't it?
Yes.
Now, I believe we've got some great questions.
We actually have quite a few, so if I might just pop over a couple of questions. We have one here from John Suarez who asked, China was welcomed into a lot of international institutions as part of globalization, but as the pandemic has shown, China has corrupted those institutions. Why rely on a dictatorship that killed tens of millions of its own people? That's to the panel.
Well, I don't think China has corrupted those organizations. The WHO and its dealings with China, not a great example right now. China definitely did bad things in concealing, not being transparent, and actually punishing, rounding up people who were trying to tell the truth about that. And I think the WHO stumbled in the way it dealt with it. However, what's the alternative to bringing countries like that into the world community? Cato actually just put out a paper this week, which is on our homepage at cato.org, about was it a mistake around the year 2000 to start welcoming China into world organizations? We wanted to make China obey rules of trade. And by the way, the United States doesn't obey all the WTO rules. Europe doesn't obey all the WTO rules. WTO, which is different from WHO, is an attempt to get countries to not shoot themselves in the foot by having bad trade policies. So I don't believe China by itself can corrupt these organizations. It may be that Europe and the United States and other countries need to be more forceful in saying these are the rules, you need to play by these rules. And there are lots of ways that diplomats try to do that. Russia was admitted into the G8 and then it was asked to leave the G8 because of things it was doing. China can also be dealt with in that way. But at this point, the idea of trying to exclude China from world trade or blockade, not deal with China, I just don't think is very plausible. I mean, what is the alternative there?
I'd like to add also that something I learned from a Cato paper from a few years ago. Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Yeah. From a few years ago is that, and the touch on what David said is actually, this is worth repeating. The biggest offender in actually violating the rules, over subsidizing, unilaterally imposing tariffs that it shouldn't, is the US, more than China. And China also relatively is a better complier once it's been sued in the WTO than the US, and Europe isn't too great either. So it's worth thinking. And the other thing that's important to actually know, there's a really fantastic book by Ronald Coase and Ning Wang about how China became capitalist that actually shows a part of the equation that we forget about China being brought into the WTO, which is the impact it had on the Chinese people and how it lifted literally millions out of poverty, not only making, allowing us to benefit from a lot of things that they were producing, but we always forget that aspect. And it is true that since 2012, since the book was written, China has actually kind of reined back in a lot of its freer type policies, but I think it's like we have to be very careful on blaming China for everything. And in fact, Scott Lincecum's paper that David mentioned, one of the things that Scott really does well in the paper is like it shows that the main problem, at least when it comes to the US, of China being entering the WTO is not so much the impact on trade, on our economy of more trade and trade competition, but it's actually the adjustment within the US created by actually all sorts of government rules.
Now, we may have time for one more question, but before we move on from that question, Stephanie, did you want to add anything to that, or should we get a new question?
I have lots I could say. One of the things I was thinking of was, our attempts to force illiberal societies to conform to our way of life by blockading them hasn't worked for Cuba, which the United States has been basically, refusing to engage with for 55 years. And so this gets back to David's point that the alternatives available to us are pretty limited. And the other thing I would just say, my colleague Eric Boehm has a great piece in the last issue of Reason Magazine where he makes the point, which also has been raised, but just to put a finer point on it, that it's not the case that these folks are just against trading with China because China is a horrible human rights violator and doesn't play by the rules. I mean, these tariffs have been imposed against the EU. It's definitely that they're using the human rights abuses by China to justify the policies that they want, even in cases where they don't. It clearly is not relevant at all. So it's some important things to keep in mind.
All right. Well, I think we have time for one more quick question. If you all promise me quick answers.
I do have a quick question here for everyone. Traditionally, libertarians have believed that countries that trade together don't go to war with each other. Is this still true? Can we start with you, David?
It's more true than the alternative. There were some arguments recently that, like 20 years ago, you get older, everything seems recent. 20 years ago, there was a discussion of whether the United States bombing Serbia was the first clear violation of one aspect of that rule, which was no two countries with a McDonald's have ever gone to war with each other. That says something about globalization. We did bomb Serbia. Nevertheless, it is generally the case, I think, still, that liberal countries, democratic countries, are less likely to go to war.
Veronique, Stephanie?
I agree.
It certainly provides a disincentive, if nothing else.
Fantastic. Well, I think we need to wrap it up there. We have run out of time. Thank you to each of you for your time, for your expertise and sharing that with us and being a part of the 24 hours of liberty. As I say, we're saving the best till last. You weren't quite last, so maybe saving the second best till second last. I don't know how to put that.
Yeah.
But we really appreciate it.
This conference is a great example of globalization, by the way.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. And what a great conference it's been. And you are a part of contributing to what a great event this has been. So thank you so much for your time. We do appreciate it. And hopefully we'll do this again next year and we'll have you back then.
Thanks.
Thank you.